Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Port Washington Public Library. I see a lot of familiar faces, but I know we also have some guests in the audience today, so welcome. My name is Keith Klang. I'm the director of the Port Washington Library. Thank you for being here with us today, and a special thank you to our Nautical Advisory Council and Friends of the Library for sponsoring this very special event. Before we begin our presentation, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge Tom Donahue, for whom this presentation is in memory of. Tom served on the Library Board of Trustees from 1998 to 2018, 20 years. He was passionate for local history and was a strong advocate for lifelong learning. Tom was always a flight enthusiast who, as a child, rode his bicycle from his home in Kew Gardens to the end of the LaGuardia Airport runway, just to watch the planes take off and land. As an adult, his favorite pastime was listening to his air traffic control scanner and watching planes on his computer. Tom's wife, Dorothy, is in our audience today, and his son, TJ, is joining us remotely via Zoom. We are so grateful for Tom's service to our library, and we know he is smiling down on this special program today. With that, I would like to introduce Vanessa Nastro, archivist and special collections curator here at the Port Washington Public Library, who will introduce our program speaker.
Hello. Okay. Thank you all for coming out here for this really exciting program. Given the connection and history Pan Am has in Port Washington, this is a collaboration long time coming. I'm really excited to introduce our presenter today. Before I do, I just want to take a minute to reiterate for those on Zoom, we have you muted, but as always, you can type any question that you have in the chat and we will read those out during the Q&A. For those here in person, we will have time at the end for Q&A. We will ask that you raise your hand if you have a question and someone will come around. I will come around with the microphone so everyone can hear your question. And for those of you here in person, please take a moment and do silence your cell phone before the program begins. Thank you. Linda Freire has worked in the aviation industry for 30 years, starting out as a flight attendant. She is the founder and chair of the Pan Am Museum Foundation, which is located inside the Cradle of Aviation. So we're so happy to have her here. She's going to do a wonderful presentation. So without further ado, please help me welcome Linda Freire.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed your pre-departure beverage. And I thank our two crew members that are here, Wendy Knecht and Patty Dowd, who are helping us out today and came in uniform, so thank you. As Vanessa said, my name is Linda Freire, and I'm the chair of the Pan Am Museum Foundation. That's our departure. We're about ready to take part on a virtual flight for Pan Am and Pan Am history with Port Washington. Many thanks to Vanessa Nastro, James Hunter, Keith Klang for inviting us to display the wonderful Pan Am vintage art destination posters. And I hope you've all had an opportunity to visit some of the posters in the display cases in the gallery. In its 64-year existence, Pan Am produced hundreds of posters promoting aircraft, service, and destinations. So let's get ready for takeoff. Make sure your seats are in the upright position. Your tray tables are stowed and locked, and keep your eyes on the screen in front of you. So the Pan Am Museum Foundation was founded in 2015 by myself and another flight attendant named Andrea Sider, who just happened upon the plaque that exists in the harbor of Port Washington. We were contacted by the city of Marseille because they wanted to put a commemorative plaque in honor of the 75th anniversary of the first transatlantic crossing. And so the idea was born to create a Pan Am Museum. The museum has opened 11 exhibits dedicated to telling the incredible story of Pan Am. We invite each of you to visit us to learn more about Pan Am. And if you contact us in advance, we will be happy to try to set up a personal tour. So right now, we're going to start looking at some of the exhibits that are on display at the museum. On the screen now, you'll see part of the 747 exhibit that we have. On the upper right-hand corner, that is your right, yes, is the part of the display case from the B314, the era that we're going to be talking about today. And then on the bottom right, you'll see a uniform on display, and that uniform is from the 1958 launch of the 707, which was when Pan Am launched the jet age. There's also some plates you might see, and those are charger plates. And I don't know if you know that Pan Am actually had a subsidiary called IHG Hotels, and you may be IHC at the time that they were launched. You may be aware of the hotel chain. It still exists today. When Pan Am went out of business, it was sold earlier in Pan Am's history, but those are charger plates from the original, one of the original hotels that opened in Belém, Brazil. On the screen now you see a captain's hat, and we always used to like to say, because Pan Am was distinguished, and that the Pan Am captains, Pan Am pilots wore white hats. So we were the guys in the white hats. You could always tell the good guys from the white cap. And this cap was donated by the family of Captain Weeks, who flew for Pan Am for over 30 years and operated many of our inaugural trips. We have a lot more information about Captain Weeks on display at the museum. The next slide is of the jumbo jet. It's a lot of information about the specifics of the aircraft, because it was truly one of a kind. And they called it Queen of the Skies because it truly did reign over the global airline industry for over 50 years. And it is considered the most successful aircraft in aviation history. And Pan Am was proud to be the launch carrier of the 747. And it was the only time in aviation history that an airline has been so instrumental in the design and development and implementation of an aircraft. You'll also see now the Pan Am Worldport, and this was Pan Am's iconic terminal at JFK. Sadly, the Worldport was torn down in 2013 by the Port Authority of New York. But it was also the impetus, when they tore the terminal down, it was an impetus for all of us who hold Pan Am so dear to us. It was part of our family that we needed a place to call home, a tangible place. And that is another reason that motivated us to found the museum. The next slide is a timeline of 64 years of Pan Am history. Now, I guess maybe because we were bored, didn't know what to do, but this was our COVID project. We were on the phone, we were on Zoom calls, we were talking to everybody, and the hardest thing we had to do was to narrow down the number of events to put on the timeline. The timeline is displayed on a 22-foot wall in the museum, and it was a difficult process to just pick those events that were so pivotal in not only Pan Am history, in world history, and aviation history. But we did it, and we're really proud of the completed project. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the poster exhibit that we have on display here in the gallery. Each poster was designed as a cultural connection to the destinations for global travelers of the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. Artists of the time were hired to create inviting works of art to entice the wealthy to fly internationally on Pan American Airways. And you'll notice I said Pan American Airways. When the airline was founded, it was called Pan American Airways. As time evolved, so did the name, and so did the logos. In the 50s, we were now called Pan American World Airways, and then, of course, people probably got tired of writing all of that, and it became Pan Am. On this next slide, we're going to see an image of the poster that's called Mod Girl. It's also known as Twiggy. And in the picture is Meg Gage Williams of a company called Stick No Bills. Stick No Bills is the licensed poster art specialist who restore and remaster Pan Am's advertising campaigns. The campaigns were designed to export the American dream while simultaneously instilling a deep desire to travel and to do so with Pan Am style. The official Pan Am poster art collection includes spectacular illustrations from artists such as Paul George Lawler, Edward McKnight Coffer, Aaron Fine, Jean Carlou, and Aaron Amspoker. And we are pleased to have many of these posters on display at the museum, but you get the treat this month at Washington Library in having these fine, beautiful posters on display. And several of them are also available for purchase if you wish. Another poster that's on display here is actually the theme of this year in Pan Am history, and that was we celebrated Pan Am Mania, we called it, or some people would call it Beatlemania, because this year was the 60th anniversary of Pan Am bringing the Beatles to the United States. And so we have an iconic photo of the Beatles arriving on Pan Am on display in the gallery. The next slide is a selection of posters from the 1930s and 40s, and you'll see on the first one there is Havana, and Pan Am's first flight was in 1927, October 27th to be exact, from Key West, Florida to Havana, Cuba. And that really was the launch of the airline. Other destinations that were launched fairly soon between 28, 29, and 30 included the Bahamas and a lot of South America, and that's why you'll see the Rio flying boat era depicted in a poster. The South America destinations were pioneered very early in Pan Am history. By 1935, we were also pioneering flights across the Pacific, which was quite an endeavor and is a story unto itself. You may notice, though, at this stage, Pan Am did not have any posters of London. And you'd think that would be a natural destination to fly from New York. But of course, there were political reasons. And why did Pan Am pioneer the Pacific first? Well, we're going to talk about that in a minute. But the reason we had to go to the Pacific first was because the English would only allow Pan Am to fly to London if Imperial Airlines was the predecessor to BOAC, which is now known as British Airways. So they would only allow Pan Am to fly to London if Imperial Airlines had identical route authority and the aircraft capable of crossing the Atlantic. And they did not, in the early 30s, have that kind of capability. It wasn't until 1939, when out of the seaplane base, that Imperial Airlines then was able to have an aircraft. And we'll talk about the B-314, which enabled both Pan Am and Imperial to fly across the Atlantic. The next slide is Pan Am, Nassau, India, and the Orient. And here you can see now we're talking about in the 40s that Pan Am has conquered or pioneered the trans-Pacific flights. And you'll see posters for destinations in the Orient, as it was called, and India and Pakistan in Asia. In 1947, we also pioneered what was called the Round the World flight. There was a famous Pan Am Flight 1 and 2, which went all around the world. On the screen now is USA by Clipper. Pan Am created posters, of course, to encourage people to visit the United States. We sent a lot of Americans overseas, but we wanted a lot of them to come back over here and visit with us too, and especially come to New York. That was Pan Am's corporate headquarters. You'll notice, can we go back one? Oh, no. Can we go back one slide? I meant to point out, you'll notice, and you can tell the vintage age of the poster by the tagline, and if you can read it. But the tagline for posters from the 40s said, "The system of the flying clippers." And that's when we were flying, pretty much flying boats. The Stratocruiser, which was the next airplane developed after the flying boats, a land-based aircraft, was inaugurated in the late 1940s. Okay, change. But by the 1950s now, the tagline had changed, and it became the world's most experienced airline. And there's a reason for that, and that was because of the expertise of the Pan Am pilots, who were considered masters of ocean flying boats. Okay, the next slide shows Pan Am as it was launching the jet age in the late 1950s and the 1960s. And now we see a very iconic London poster. And this poster has been celebrated and has received a lot of attention of late. We sold 2 of the mastered originals of this poster. They're probably about 8 feet tall at our gala that we held at the museum on October 5th. And believe it or not, it was remastered by Stickno Bills. There's gold leaf framing around it, and it is an exquisite poster. We have a similar one on display here in the gallery, but it sold at auction at our gala for $22,000. The next slide are posters from the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. So now Pan Am is hiring famous photographers such as Ivan Terminoff and Tom Gesmer, who had a more modernist take on Pan Am posters. Interestingly enough, there is a collection of these posters of Terminoff and Gesner at the MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. And they have from time to time held exhibitions on this poster collection. And now you can also tell the era of the posters, the ones that were photographs, by the placement of the name of the company, Pan Am. At the early 70s, the airline's name was on the side. These were the Terminoff and Gesner posters. After about 1974, 1975, the name of the airline is in the upper right-hand corner of the poster. So you can tell that's late 70s or 80s in the posters. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about Pan Am history and how it became involved in Port Washington. On the screen right now is an image of Juan Trippe, and Juan Trippe is the visionary founder and long-term CEO of Pan American World Airways. He was born on June 27, 1899 in Seabright, New Jersey, to a wealthy family that made its fortune in the 1800s by building, owning, and shipping on clipper sailing ships. And of course, that background and experience that he had in his youth was important as he became the CEO of Pan American, because Pan American planes were named clippers. So obviously, he brought this over from his youth. There's a quote from Leonardo da Vinci that says, "Once you have tasted flight, you will forever walk the earth with your eyes turned skyward, for there you have been, and there you will always long to return." No phrase was more true to a young man than this quote was to Juan Trippe. As a boy, he witnessed Wilbur Wright's 1909 flight around the Statue of Liberty. As a teenager, he learned to fly. In 1917, he was a student at Yale University. But he left, because this was during World War I, and he left to become a military pilot despite the desires of his father, who was a very wealthy banker and wanted his son to follow in his footsteps. But that was not the future for Juan Trippe. During his service, he was commissioned as an ensign in the U.S. Naval Reserve, but he did not see combat as the war ended before he could go overseas. So he returned to Yale in 1919 to continue his education and helped form the Yale Flying Club. He had the bug, and a lot of pioneers of the aviation industry existed at this time. The Eddie Rickenbackers, the Howard Hughes, they were all pivotal in the development of the aviation industry, not only in this country, but around the world. On the right of your screen, you'll see it's a very iconic image of Juan Trippe with what is considered a very famous globe, at least to those of us in the Pan Am family who are very well aware of the globe. The globe was more than office decor, and it held a place of pride in his office. It symboled his lofty ambitions to make the world smaller. He used the vintage globe to mark future Pan Am international routes. Today, this globe has another place of pride, and that is in the Smithsonian Museum. The next slide is a photo of two very iconic gentlemen, Juan Trippe and Charles Lindbergh. And yes, they were friends and they worked together. Trippe was a very strategic, forward-thinking individual, visionary. He saw things and made them happen that other people couldn't even conceive of at the time. So he was at Mitchell Field, Roosevelt Field, when Lindbergh took off on the Spirit of St. Louis bound for Le Bourget in Paris. And he knew then that this was a person he needed to have working for his new airline. Now, don't forget, Lindbergh's flight was in May of 1927. Pan Am's first flight was October of 1927. So by 1928, the two had met, and with an eye toward practicality and publicity, Trippe hired Charles Lindbergh, one of the great heroes of the age, to help him pioneer new routes to South America, Japan, China, and across the Atlantic. Lindbergh went on to develop the international routes that are still used by commercial aviation airlines today. For the Atlantic, he served both the northern route, called the Great Circle Route, as it is the most direct route from New York to London. This route crosses eastern Canada via Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and out over the North Atlantic. But he also surveyed the southern route through Bermuda, the Azores, to Lisbon, and then on to Marseille. Ultimately, he recommended Pan Am use the southern route as the most practical due to the stormy weather and icy conditions in the North Atlantic. Pan Am had an eye on this, and after hiring Lindbergh, they started planning to explore and operate transatlantic flights as early as 1929. Juan Trippe would go on as the CEO of Pan Am until his retirement in 1968, and he stayed on at Pan Am for several years more as the chairman of the board, and he sadly passed away in 1981. On the screen now, you'll see the different eras of Pan Am, from the mail and aviation pioneering era, which I just touched on a little bit, 1927 to 1930, and what we're going to talk about more today, which is the flying boat era, which is kind of before the war, but kind of going a little bit into the war, but basically considered 1930 to 1941. The World War II era is broken down to 1941 to 45, and then after the war, we'll talk a little bit about why, the further development of land planes, which is the post-war period 1945 to 1958, the jet age 1958 to 1970, and the jumbo jet era 1970 to 1991. And if you think back, you can also see how these posters really chronicled the history and evolution of Pan Am as well. On the screen now is one of my favorite images of the B314, and this is taking off from Port Washington, as a matter of fact. This is and on the screen is a quote from Claire Booth-Luce, a playwright, United States Congresswoman, and ambassador to Italy. And this is probably one of my favorite quotes about the airline. Years from now, we will look back upon Pan American's flying boats as the most glamorous, romantic air travel in the world. And she was right. Even at the time, the romance of flying on a clipper was revered around the world, especially for those who could afford to fly on a clipper or flying boat. And it was the airline and the airplanes were depicted in famous movies, including Flying Down to Rio, which was basically a movie made to talk about Pan Am's flying boats. And then the classic film Casablanca, starring Humphrey Bogart. So let's talk about this spectacular aircraft and why it pretty much had a very short legacy, a very short time frame of existence, but why it really changed the world and made the world smaller. As I mentioned before, Pan Am pioneered trans-Pacific flights, and on the screen you'll see an image of the Yankee Clipper. But as I mentioned before, Pan Am had to pioneer the Pacific before the Atlantic due to the ongoing political issues and reciprocity issues with the UK. So the Boeing 314 Clipper was the most revolutionary airplane of its time. It was larger than any aircraft before it. It could carry more passengers in unbridled luxury and carry them farther than any aircraft yet built. 12 B-314s were built, 9 of which served with Pan Am. 3 served with Imperial Airlines, and therein comes the ability of Imperial Airlines to now fly transatlantic flights, and that's when the route authority was given to Pan Am as well. The aircraft was 106 feet long with an incredible 152-foot wingspan. It was powered by 4 Wright R-26 Cyclone 14-cylinder engines, a revolutionary design that provided 1,600 horsepower per engine. For all of you people who are very interested in the specifics of the aircraft and the technological aspects of the aircraft. It was a state-of-the-art technology. The R-2600 went on to power the iconic North American B-25 medium bomber during World War II. The airplane was so large, including the wings, that it was possible for a flight engineer to actually enter the wing, service the engines, and even do minor maintenance. I can't imagine what the noise level must have been, But in a minute, we're going to look at a cutout of a version of the B314. You'll be able to see some of the compartments, including where the engineer could go and service the engines, excuse me. The B314 had a maximum takeoff weight of 82,500 pounds, of which 26,000 was for fuel, or about 4,300 gallons. This gave it a range of 3,500 miles. The range was critical because the airplane had to be able to fly the route from the U.S. West Coast to Hawaii, roughly 2,400 miles. And that span of ocean is the longest air route on the planet without a place to land. So the planes, you had to make it, else you were ditching. Not a fun thing to do in the middle of the Pacific. A later version, designated the B314A, had a slightly higher gross weight and longer range. The B314 could carry up to 74 passengers on short daytime routes, say something like a San Francisco to LAX flight, but was limited to only 24 people on long overnight routes. The stewards could convert seats into 40 sleeping berths, and you had to book the berths in advance if there was a lot of passengers, but obviously all the over-ocean flights were limited to 22 passengers, so there were plenty of berths available for anybody who wanted to sleep. The question often comes up, why a flying boat? Why not use a land plane that uses a runway and an airport? Well, at that time, in the late 1930s, the commercial aviation industry was still in its infancy, and no land planes existed that could carry a profitable load, because a lot of these planes carried a lot of cargo and a lot of mail, over intercontinental distances. World War II changed all of that with the development of the Douglas DC-4 and its successor, the Lockheed Constellation. Sadly, today, no remaining airframes of the B-314 exist. They were all either sunk or crashed. And so there's no identical, you can't go see a B-314 except for the full replica of the B-14 that exists in the Foyne Flying Boat and Maritime Museum in Foyne, Ireland. And that is a real incredible trip. If you ever want to go to Ireland and see a vestige of this era, it is a full replica and it's a museum there as well. It's pretty spectacular. So on April 16th, 1939, Pan Am completed the first transatlantic survey flight using the aircraft you see on the screen, the Yankee Clipper, to bases in the Azores, Lisbon, Portugal, Marseille, France, England, and Iceland. On the screen now you see images from the upper deck, the flight deck, I should say. You'll see that the navigator is working on what's kind of like a drafting table. And this is how they plotted the navigation. There was no GPS in those days. And the maps were somewhat okay, but what did they have to use? They used celestial navigation. And that's how they plotted. There was a celestial navigation dome over the cockpit of the plane, and a navigator could go up with what was a sextant, and we have the sextant on display. One of the sextants from the B-314 we have on the display case out here. And they would plot the navigation by the stars. Now here's the cutout of the B-314 showing the separate compartments. And you can see there's a stairs on the forward end of the plane where the pilots are walking up, because the flight deck again is on the upper level. And then there is a large cockpit. There was a crew of 12 people on these flights. 2 were stewards. And then you can see there's a little, you can kind of see it, there's a little dome at the top that looks kind of like a little periscope. And then there's an image of a man kind of in the engine there, and that's where they would walk through the wings to service the engines in flight. But again, I can't even imagine what the noise level must have been to have worked or tried to work on the engines in flight. But the lower deck also featured a dining salon, a cocktail lounge, passenger seating, a honeymoon suite in the back, and a separate lavatory dressing room for men and women. A less publicized feature was the first flush toilets ever used on a transport aircraft. Another Pan Am first. And there's a better image here now on the screen of the dining salon. And please notice the fine china that was used, and we have some of the china on display as well. The china that was used was very heavy. It was, you know, the kind of china at the time that was, it was solid. Also with silverware, silver service sets. Everything was very heavy, I can't imagine. Along with linen tablecloths, crystal glasses, and full waiter service. The steward was responsible for all phases of dining on board the aircraft, from shopping for the food, to loading the aircraft, to preparing, cooking, and serving, and of course, cleaning up afterwards. The steward wore white dinner jackets for dinner service, as it was truly a five-star dining experience in the sky. Pan Am Clippers were built to offer the first-class traveler the ultimate in luxury on board. So what is the menu for this first flight that was in 1939? The first transatlantic passenger flight included some appetizers, turtle soup, filet mignon, mashed potatoes, asparagus hollandaise, alligator pear salad, I'm not sure what alligator pear salad is, but with lemon oil dressing, biscuit tortoni, coffee, tea, and after dinner mints. And when I was looking through our archives, after dinner mints seemed to be very popular because they were almost served for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Anyway. So the next slide is of the sleeping berths that were on board the aircraft. And I'll take the word of those who actually used them that said they were very comfortable. So you also see a picture on the right side of the screen of the ladies' lounge. Okay, the next slide is we're going to talk about now Pan Am and Port Washington. And this is an image of the first planes to use the Port Washington seaplane base, which is a Sikorsky S-42. Now, these airplanes did a lot of the survey flights out of Port Washington in 1937. Pan Am had actually contracted for the seaplane base in 1934, but it wasn't until 1937 when we established an Atlantic division. It was in the spring of 1937, with the intent of starting New York to Bermuda service as soon as possible. Pan Am seaplane base in Port Washington conducted first survey flights for the northern route, which took off from Port Washington to Sediac, New Brunswick, Canada. 2 days later, another survey flight departed Port Washington for Botwood, Newfoundland, again by the way of Sediac. A third flight took off from Port Washington to Southampton, England, with stops at Shediac, Botwood, and Foyne, Ireland, then on to Southampton in the UK. Later that year, survey flights departed Port Washington via the southern route through Bermuda, the Azores, Lisbon, and Marseille. All of this proved that it was possible to fly across the Atlantic. But what Pan Am didn't have was an airplane, that could do it. And so they went to the airplane industry, the manufacturers, and said, we need an airplane with longer range. So this is an image of a flying boat in the hangar, the S-42, and you'll see on the screen on the left-hand side is the actual seaplane base at Port Washington. And then on the upper right is an image of passengers waiting to board in the terminal. The terminals were a little sparse because they were pretty much basically just the hangar at that time. And then the next is of the seaplane base, an aerial view of the seaplane base with a plane taxiing out into the water to get ready for takeoff. And there's another one. As you can see, this was a busy operation. It was a short-lived operation here, but it was a busy one. There was a lot of traffic with the planes taxiing in and taxiing out, arriving and departing. The first B-314s, the aircraft that would provide Trip and Pan Am with the range capable of flying across the Atlantic. The B-314s were first delivered to Pan Am's Atlantic Division in February 1939 to conduct the survey flights to Southampton on the Yankee Clipper. The next slide is in the hangar again at Port Washington, and here now you'll see the B-314 at the seaplane base, and then on the top right you'll see the Imperial Airways B-314, because now they were flying back and forth across the Atlantic, and they were being serviced by Pan Am at the seaplane base here in Port Washington. The bottom right is then an image of passengers waiting to board the seaplane for some destination. I'm going to show a quick video here, of the Yankee Clipper on the first transatlantic mail service flight from Port Washington through the Azores and Marseille, And this flight took, now just remember, Lindbergh's flight was in May of 27. This is only 12 years after that first flight across the Pacific that Pan Am was now operating a transatlantic flight.
Regularly scheduled transatlantic airmail goes into service on the 12th anniversary of Colonel Lindbergh's history-making flight. 100,000 letters tagged for Europe are stowed away, and the 2 stewards and 12 flight officers, whose flying totals 1.5 million miles, take their posts. The mail bags are carried in the wing compartment. Pan American officials and New York's postmaster wish success to Captain Arthur Laporte, who is in command of the flying boat. And with a roar of mighty motors, the Clipper takes off from Port Washington, headed for the Azores and Marseille. The flying boat points its propellers into the sky for a 26.5-hour hop to Europe, and an American ship, flown by an American crew, conquers the Atlantic, last frontier of commercial aviation.
Can you imagine? So that was in May, on the 12th anniversary of Lindbergh's flight, that Pan Am inaugurated the first transatlantic mail service with almost a ton of mail that was carried on the aircraft from Port Washington to Marseille, France. And as he said, arrived in Lisbon in 26 hours. Yeah, yes. June 17th, the Atlantic Clipper made its first passenger flight over the Atlantic with 16 passengers consisting of radio and newspaper reporters. Okay, now we've got a slide showing this is the inaugural crew of the Dixie Clipper flight, which was the first passenger flight across the Atlantic. That flight took off on June 28th. And the next one is June 28th, 1939. This is an image of passengers boarding the Dixie Clipper ready to take off from Port Washington on this first transatlantic passenger flight. And this is an image of all the people that came out to witness this historic flight. And this is an image of the Dixie Clipper taking off. The first passenger scheduled transatlantic flight departed Port Washington, as I said, June 28, 1939, with 22 passengers. The flight had a waiting list of 500 people. In recognition of the significance of the inaugural transatlantic flight, the 85-piece Port Washington High School band played for thousands of onlookers gathered to watch the historical departure. This was a community event. Prior to this event, the fastest way for onlookers to cross the Atlantic to Southampton was aboard the RMS Queen Mary, which made the sea voyage in 1938 in a record time of 3 days, 20 hours, and 42 minutes. The Dixie Clipper made the same journey in 42 hours, which included nearly 30 hours of flying time. So who were some of these passengers on this first flight? Well, some of the notable passengers included multi-millionaire Cornelius Vanderbilt Whitney and his wife, and the wife of Pan Am founder Juan Trippe, Mrs. Betty Stettines Trippe. Passenger number 1 was a gentleman by the name of William John Eck from the Southern Railroad. Eck began writing to Pan Am to secure a ticket on the first transatlantic flight back in 1931. He was very patient. Unfortunately, passenger number 1 position was already taken by humorist Will Rogers. Tragically, Rogers was killed in an Alaskan airplane accident, which then allowed Mr. Eck to become passenger number 1. And he wrote about his travel. He had a journal, and he, diary. He put in his diary everything that he did on the flight, everything, the effect of the flight, the feel of the flight, what it meant to him. And his scrapbook from the flight is in the collection of the Smithsonian. The B-314 had a galley crewed by chefs from 5-star hotels. This was travel for the super rich, priced at $900. Now this is 1939. From New York to Southampton. On board, now I talked a few minutes ago about the press flight which departed before the passenger flight. So on board the press flight was a Alice Rogers Hager. She was an American journalist, author, and novelist known for her coverage of aviation news. She was also a writer for the New York Times and the Washington Star. She reported on aviation for the North American Newspaper Alliance. She told one of the captains to wake her up so she could see the sunrise from the airplane. This is just a part of her report. At 10 minutes after 2, the steward shook my curtains and said, "Captain's compliments, madam. Venus is about to rise." Two of us did roll out of the warm comfort of our berths at that summons, threw on a few clothes, and went with Captain Winston up to the flight deck to stand on the little ladder into the star hatch being that celestial navigation dome. The conical glass blister on the topmost point of the middling surface is the vantage from which star positions are shot by the navigator. Had it been anywhere but where it was, the scene would have been romantic, but not out of the ordinary. In mid-ocean, isolated from the water below by that deep, impenetrable layer upon layer of cloud, it was fantastic. She went on later to describe, "But poetry cannot tell the story of this thing man has done with wings, even to those who have seen them grow from frail, fumbling things to this proud craft that takes the kingdom of the birds as its right. There is admiration and respect for the fine mind and scientific discipline that can run an airline over the world's toughest ocean." I was just amazed by the prose and the feeling that she injected into her report. Now, there's another column from the editor of The Sun, John C.A. Watkins, who wrote about the flight upon his arrival in Paris. A lot of the passengers, once they arrived into Marseille, were transported up to Paris. "Those of us who walked down Broadway only 47 and a half hours ago this afternoon strolled along the Champs-Élysées, hoping they would not awaken from a dream too amazing to be true. From New York to Azores to Lisbon to Marseille and to Paris in less than 2 days is just too much for one person to absorb." And then another more kind of tongue-in-cheek write-up was in Vogue by Mrs. Betsy Schaefer. And she wrote, "When my husband first came home with the news that we were flying the Atlantic, I suddenly realized I wasn't the type. Planning for the trip went on for days, what to wear, what to bring. She was astonished to learn that they wore formal dress for dinner. I began explaining to taxi drivers carefully that I was flying the Atlantic. Finally, the day arrived. We gathered at the office on 42nd Street. And then a philosophical friend made me promise to write him an account of the flight, not what you feel, but what you learn from your fellow passengers. With much waving and feeling of being led to a slaughter, I walked down the long pier muttering, 'Stiff upper lip,' and realizing Joan d'Arc and the stake had nothing on the little mother, the woman that day. The door was closed, locked, the safety belts tightened. It was too late now. We taxied across the bay. The ship was turned into the wind. The motors were tested. The moment of hesitation before the throttle is open wide. And thus began the most casual, calm, matter-of-fact trip I have ever experienced, bar none, from the moment we left the water. It became an easing off, a relaxing the tension I had built up on land. In a short time, the stewards were serving lunch, and while it was nice to look down on the Montauk Lighthouse, by the time we passed over Nantucket, our last sight of land, I found myself saying, 'Oh, yes, nice island,' and going right on with my strawberry shortcake. Some of the passengers retired to their berths to take a nap in the afternoon and had to be awakened later for dinner. We deposited a bride and groom the next morning at Horta. I told you they used the honeymoon suite. We were all very gay and secretly proud that our night over the ocean was coming to a close. We glided into Lisbon Harbor. For 24 hours, we had been in a world all our own. This was Europe, yes, this was Europe. And now we're going to see a video of the Dixie Clipper, the passenger flight, arriving into Marseille.
Of the first regular passenger airplane flight across the Atlantic, the Dixie Clipper at Marseille, after a sky voyage from New York in 28 hours and 50 minutes. Now, all ashore. 22 passengers and a crew of 11, 33 in all. There were survey flights, and there was a press preview flight for newspaper and radio people. This is the first on the schedule for paying passengers. So these are the first flighters. Trans-Pacific air service began several years ago, but the Atlantic was tough. Now it's conquered.
Pretty amazing, huh? And that's the terms that they use, conquered. It was kind of like a space place, like flying to the moon today would be today. And this is a slide of the plaque that is in the Port Washington Harbor. And if you ever get down to the harbor, you can see the plaque that was dedicated in the early 1960s by the Wings Club of Manhattan and Pan Am. And it really commemorates the Pan Am survey flights and first transatlantic flight.
Of the first regular.
Okay, so just now in closing, a few minutes about the Pan Am Museum Foundation. As I mentioned, we are located at the Cradle of Aviation. We're a museum within a museum. We're on the 3rd floor, and we hope you do maybe come and visit us. The Pan Am podcast, sorry about that. The Pan Am podcast is an award-winning program of the Museum Foundation. We launched in 2021. We have 50 episodes published to date, and that I ask you to, if you're interested in listening in our podcast, and I hope you are, the next published podcast will be about the first transatlantic flight and the B-314s, and we have some special guests who will be participating in that podcast. So that'll be episode 51. We also have a YouTube channel, and we have a lot of vintage videos of Pan Am and flight service, those of us who worked on board the aircraft. We're really pleased with the popularity of the YouTube channel. We have over 3.5 million followers on the YouTube channel. So as I like to say, the Pan Am brand is alive and well, and we're happy to carry on that legacy. We also have events, and an upcoming event will be in April of 2024, and that, I'm sorry, well, the date is April 24, 2025. So that is the 50th anniversary of Operation Baby Lift. Operation Baby Lift, if you don't know, was Pan Am's participation with the U.S. government in evacuating over 30,000 Amerasian children and orphans from South Vietnam just prior to the fall of South Vietnam during the Vietnam War. And in closing, I want to thank you, but I also want to show this video, which kind of gives purpose to what we are doing here with the museum in preserving the legacy of this airline that not only is dear to us and was a family to us, but pioneered, has so much connection to not only aviation history, but to world history. And it was a pivotal moment in time for 64 years. Pan Am and the people of Pan Am made a difference.
For millennia, humanity traveled mainly by foot, by horse, or by sail. The world was disconnected, its various cultures, cities, and nations separated by dangerous distances and vast oceans. Then, suddenly, we were given the gift of wings. Wings that inspired a visionary leader with a dream he would call Pan Am. Today, there are more and more people asking, what was Pan Am, and who were these explorers who pioneered the sky? That dream was nothing less than linking the Earth for the first time in human history, of bringing our species together by conquering the space between us, of uniting the world through kindness and one breathtaking innovation after another. Pan Am wasn't just an airline or a means of getting from one place to another faster than ever. It was an adventure. It was a discovery. It was a hope that we could help humanity change course and reshape its future. As for those who joined up for this vision, the pilots, the engineers, the mechanics, the flight attendants, the nurses, the navigators, each of them braved the challenges and obstacles with determination that one day passengers would fly to every corner of the earth and come home safely, forever changed by their experience. Who were these people? The ones who dedicated themselves to the mastery of flight, who accepted the mission of bringing Pan Am to life. Look around. They are you. Today, you celebrate the spirit that succeeded in being where no one had gone before. The thrill of opening fresh vistas with new technologies. You remember the resolve with which Pan Am lent a hand in time of disaster. The courage it summoned in moments of danger. The determination it displayed during the inevitable struggles of war. For decades, Pan Am was always there. Not just for our country, but for the world. On December 4th, 1991, our company ceased operations, but our family never went away. Pan Am may be gone, but the dream that gave birth to it remains. And the mission of those who gave life to that dream is not over. We must pass our inspiration to generations yet to come. For though we have made the earth seem smaller, there is work yet to do. Let us show the children of tomorrow how we did it. Let us prepare them for their own journey into the future. Let us give them our wings.
So thank you so much. Part of our purpose here today was to help us give you our wings. And I thank Vanessa and Keith very much for their hospitality, inviting us here, and we hope you've enjoyed the presentation. And I guess if there's any questions, we can certainly entertain. Okay, sure. I'm still mic'd.
You're still mic'd?
Okay,
Okay,
I
great.
think so.
Okay, so we'll start taking questions from the floor, and then we'll check in with our Zoom audience if they have any questions as well. Okay? Yes. Do you...
Yeah. Isn't there one with the website? Did Linda make it back? Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, Hi.
Hi.
Thank you. That was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
But I look at Manhasset Bay today and I see all the boats out there. And I'm sure there were boats in the
Yes.
days of Pan Am
Yes,
landing and taking off. How did that work? Were there lanes
Yes.
particularly for
There
the
were ship-
planes
yes.
and boats were not allowed at all in those lanes?
Yes,
or
and
just
they had schedules. And as you might have seen from a couple of the aerial views, you could see the boats in the pictures. So they were around, but there were channels, as they called them, that were specific for the airplanes to take off.
So were there accidents or not?
I think it was pretty well controlled. I'm not aware of any accidents
Yeah.
that happened because of a ship
Yeah.
colliding with an airplane. But
I
yeah.
often wonder about that when I
Yeah,
look at all
no,
the
I mean,
boats. out
Pan
there.
Am was, along with providing luxury and premium customer service, it was paramount importance was safety. So it took any kind of measure. There was a gentleman who was an executive of Pan Am. His name is, oh gosh, now his name just went out of my head, but he was adamant about standards and procedures. And he would also always make sure that safety was the first and foremost thing
Yeah.
that and that's why the pilots were called masters of ocean flying boats, because they had to master navigation, whether it be terrestrial on the ground or celestial. So there wasn't that kind of thing really. They made sure the channels were
Thank you.
clear. Sure, my pleasure. You have a question?
Thank you so much. I just want to say this isn't really a question. My late brother, Mark Seiler, was one of the 10 most traveled Pan Am passengers.
Thank you.
And he used to go around the world on Pan Am Flight 1 and Flight 2, particularly because his business took him very often to Australia. But he said in a lifetime of travel, there was nothing to match the stewardesses on Flight 1 and Flight 2 for cosseting all the passengers, seeing to their needs, paying attention, particularly any children on board. He said they were marvelous. So I think we should all applaud the memory of these great ladies and gentlemen.
And,
Thank you.
let me take a minute too, because we have some of my colleagues here. Please, Pan Am flight attendants, stand up. Get recognized. There's a gentleman right here.
A question and a comment.
Okay.
Do you have any insight why they went bankrupt?
Oh boy, how long have you got? It's a long story. It's not one single thing. Part of the reason behind the demise of Pan Am, sadly, was the lack of domestic route structure, because we needed a feeder. A lot of the international airlines, a lot of the domestic airlines, American United, TWA, were given international routes, but Pan Am's request to the government for domestic routes was consistently denied by what was the CAB in the 50s and 60s. You might ask why. Part of that is because of the status that Juan Trippe had. Juan Trippe was not only a visionary figure and chairman and founder of Pan Am, but he had all kinds of connections to heads of state. People often during World War II, when Churchill wanted to speak to somebody representing the United States, instead of calling the ambassador, who was Joseph Kennedy, he contacted Juan Trippe. And that also explains some things that happened later on in the 60s when John Kennedy was president. So, but beyond the lack of domestic routes, we had this beautiful airplane, the 747, which was incredible. But we took on a lot of debt when we bought so many of the 747s. And it also happened at the same time that there was an oil embargo in the early 70s, you remember, and a lot of the planes, the price of oil and fuel skyrocketed, and flights were not full, not like we needed them to be. And so there was a debt, a substantial debt. And probably the final blow, unfortunately, was in 1988 over Lockerbie, Scotland. And for those of you who may remember, Pan Am 103 was blown up out of the sky. And many of us here were there working for the airline, working for Pan Am at the time. And Pan Am, because it was considered the unofficial flag carrier of the United States, we carried a beautiful flag on the tail. It was a target. But after that, after the bombing, people just weren't flying Pan Am. And there was, they booked on anybody else but Pan Am. And financially, the company just couldn't weather that kind of hit.
The second is, according to Google, they said that Pan Am is coming back in 2025 as a private carrier.
Well, I think what you're talking about is a special transatlantic flight. On June 28th, actually, it's the second flight. They've got two flights. One's leaving June 17th, the other is June 28th. A private jet company has sponsored and is having a rather expensive luxury flight across the Atlantic to commemorate Pan Am's first transatlantic flights. And so the flight, when it was announced, actually sold out in 10 days. And it's kind of amazing because it sold out at a ticket price of $60,000. It's not just your regular flight. It goes from New York to Bermuda. You stay 2 days. It's all first class, 5-star accommodation. So they go from New York to Bermuda, Bermuda to Lisbon. They stay at the Ritz in Lisbon for 2 days, and then there's activities and entertainment in those cities. Then they go to Marseille. Then they go to London. So they mirror the southern routes and the northern routes Pan Am flew. And actually, in London, they are staying at the Savoy, and they have a luncheon or some activity at Kensington Palace. So it's a very kind of privileged flight. And then they go to Foyne Island to visit the Flying Boat Museum. So beyond that, they may be doing other of these celebratory commemorative flights, but that's pretty much it for now. We all would love to see Pan Am exist in some form or another, but to do it, they have to do it right. And so we want to make sure that we're kept in the loop. And fortunately, a lot of these organizations do contact us at the museum for our input because we lived it. We did it.
Yes, I will. Oh, I'd like to second this lady. Yeah. I'd like to second what she said. I flew to Australia and back with 3 young boys in 1966. I don't think I could have done it without the help of the flight attendants. Also, I have flown on a flying boat, and I flew from New Zealand to Australia.
Oh, wonderful.
I won't say what year, but it was a long time ago, and I still remember parts of it.
Oh, it was pretty special then. Yes, thank you for sharing that.
Okay. Just make my way through here.
Thank you for a beautiful presentation. Really great. Really great.
Thank you. Thank you.
My question is, when did Pan Am leave Port Washington, and what were the motivating factors behind that?
Well, it was kind of premeditated, I hate to say. LaGuardia, the Marine Air Terminal at LaGuardia was actually under construction when Pan Am started operating the first transatlantic flights in 1939. Pan Am left only a year later and moved operations over to the Marine Air Terminal at LaGuardia. And the real motivating reason was because of its proximity to Manhattan. Don't forget, these flights were extremely expensive and for the wealthy. And for the most part, those people resided in Manhattan. So that was kind of the reason why it was somewhat short-lived. You're welcome.
Oh, can I stand? Hello. Those hangars in Port Washington, did they knock those down after? Were they knocked down, or they can still see those hangars or those?
I don't think the hangars are still there. I do know that you can see the tracks that they used to pull the airplane out of the water. You can see those. Those are still there. But after Pan Am left, it was sold. The land was sold. The buildings were sold to other companies. At one point, I even think Type and Steel was there.
And they built that dock and park there, right?
I'm sorry?
The park and the dock where it
Yes. Yeah. So, those companies that came in afterwards tore down the facilities, tore down the hangars.
I just want to check in with our tech team up there. Do we have any? No. Okay. We have no questions on Zoom. We still have questions on the floor. Okay. Making my way through. Okay, go ahead.
Just follow up on this gentleman. Why was Port Washington chosen?
Because it had a seaplane base already. Pan Am actually acquired the land and the hangars, I think, in 1934, as we were planning to have a transatlantic operation. So there was an existing seaplane base here, and it was just easy to move everything and to operate out of there.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
I'm reminded of the seaplanes that took off constantly from Port Washington's waters on Manhasset Bay, landing, taking off, and they had right-of-way over everything except sailboats.
Okay.
And they would come in and they would fly over to kind of warn the sailboats that they were coming in, and then take off.
Thank you.
There. But that
Thank
was
you.
In the 60s.
See, you learn something every day, right? I'll remember that if I go out in a sailboat.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so very much. I'd just like to recognize a gentleman from Great Neck who was the first flight controller for Pan Am, Mr. Chester Sackett. He lived to 99 years old and had a wonderful, wonderful career with Pan Am.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate that.
Okay. Are there any more questions? Lots of questions.
Thanks for the talk. I'm just wondering, how did they navigate at night in bad weather when they had to depend on the stars with using a sextant?
Yeah. A lot of times the planes did not fly at night. Most of the time, it happened, but they had weather charts. They had, not like we have today, obviously, but for the most part, they tried to schedule the planes to fly during the day. You didn't want to be stuck up there in bad weather because, again, it's flying at 10,000 feet. This is not really over the cloud cover. This is right in the middle, and those flights, I can't even imagine some of the service they did on these airplanes, in the B-314s, and maybe it's why up until 1944, there were only male stewards on board these planes. It was a very physical job. It was always a physical job for those of us who did it, we can tell you. But it was, I can't even imagine what it must have been like to have to pour coffee and do this kind of service on board an airplane when you're flying at 10,000 feet. So they really did try. They most of the time the flights were during the day.
We have a question over here.
Yes, I remember when I was a kid, the day they put the plaque up on Town Dock to commemorate.
Oh, yeah.
And there was a flight that came in, and it was like a replica airplane.
Oh, okay.
And I was wondering if you knew anything about that. What kind? Because it was a seaplane.
Okay.
And it didn't. I thought it was bigger than the normal seaplanes that came down, and there was some. It was some sort of celebrity aviator and a wife who had been a movie star. I don't know if you know anything about that.
Oh, okay. Well, that's Maureen O'Hara. Yeah, then it was Charlie Blair. It was Charlie Blair. Charlie Blair was a Pan Am captain, and he left Pan Am to become, he started his own airline called Antilles Airlines, and he was married to Maureen O'Hara, and she remained incredibly loyal to Pan Am even after his passing. He died in the 60s as well. He was in an airplane crash, unfortunately. And Maureen O'Hara really helped fund, remember I mentioned that Foyne Flying Boat and Maritime Museum? She helped fund that, And when she passed away, she donated her gowns and things from the Academy Awards to the museum, and they have them on display in Foyne, Ireland. So she's always been very connected to Pan Am.